Hi, my name is Mintesinot Teklu. I am an MC intern working at NIST for spring 2020 in the Physical Measurements Laboratory with my mentor, Dr. Emily G. Little. This semester, we worked on IV measurements on 3-terminal FET samples, as well as CV analysis on Moss stacks. Hope you enjoyed the talk. First, an introduction to thin film FETs. Thin film FETs, also known as field effect transistors, are an emerging technology, are emerging electronic devices used in a multitude of modern consumer electronics, such as becoming a staple in the LCD technology uh, market back in the mid 2000s, and more recently being used for a supplementary function in AMOLED high definition screens, such as those used by companies like Samsung and iPhone and Apple on their flagship smartphones. The flexibility of these transistors also allow for their use in cutting-edge technologies such as flexible solar cells, paper batteries, and flexible smartphone screens, which recently made their wide-scale consumer market debut from companies such as Samsung and Motorola. Organic semiconductors are semiconductors made up of molecules of carbon and hydrogen, or polymers bonded together to form crystallized thin film structures. Compared to most inorganic semiconductor materials, whose rigid lattices leave them highly functional but also brittle, organic semiconductors tend to sacrifice some functionality, such as less mobile charge availability, a larger gap between the valence and conduction bands, etc., for other benefits, such as ease of fabrication, mechanical flexibility, and low cost. Organic semiconductors such as FTBDT, which is pictured on the left, are sometimes used in thin film transistors. Now, despite the benefits of using organic semiconductors, there are few structural issues that make them work less optimal than um, necessary. The chemical process of manufacturing these organic semiconductors tend to leave structural deformities within the lattice, leading to electronic traps that that impede charge transfer during the device's functionality, requiring more energy to function regularly. A visual example of that is shown in the bottom right. The red spots are areas where charges could get stuck while moving through the semiconductor's lattice, and it would require a lot more energy to move them out than necessary. In this project, I ran current voltage measurements on 3-terminal thin film FET devices. By doing these measurements, we can determine the material's current voltage characteristics, which can give us information on how the semiconductor dielectric barrier behaves, as well as some information on the semiconductor layer as well. These IV characteristics can provide some information about how charge is transported through the device, which could be used to determine the effect of traps on charge transport. The graph listed, the graph shown on the right is a preview of what the output graph for this measurement project should be looking like. First, before going on to the measurements, I want to briefly talk about how the device is manufactured. The device I used had a multitude of different orientations, but in general, the samples were on silicon wafers, which you can see on the bottom left, that were coated with a layer of silicon dioxide, which is the dielectric, on top of which a layer of the organic semiconductor, for example FTBDT, is deposited and two metal contacts are placed on top. As you can see on the top left, that's a cross-sectional view of what this described device is supposed to look like. The S and D are the top metal contacts, which are called the source and drain. The OSC is the organic semiconductor. The gate dielectric was the silicon dioxide layer, and the gate electrode is the silicon wafer. Now for the method of the measurements. The IV measurements involve using a set of voltages between the source and gate contacts, which build up a charge at the semiconductor dielectric barrier. A sweeping negative voltage is then applied between the source and drain terminals, allowing for the transport of the built-up charge within the semiconductor dielectric boundary, showing an increase and saturation of current as the magnitude of this voltage increases. I do the latter process for different gate source voltage values. This should produce a graph of current curves showing the current increasing with VGS, which is due to an increase in charge buildup at the semiconductor dielectric boundary, hence more mobile charge and larger current. The graph on the left was the output from one of the devices. As you see, the line on the red line shows that this is the current measurement for when the gate source voltage was at 0 volts. The orange line shows the current curve for the gate source voltage at -4 volts, all the way up to the purple line, the purple curve, which is the current curve, for when the gate source voltage was at -20 volts, which is the highest current curve on this graph. Now to understand the irregularities with this. As you can see from the plot shown on the previous slide, which is now in the top left on this slide, at the low drain source voltage, which is around 0 to -0.5, -5.0, the plot should be more straight, as shown on the bottom left plot. Moreover, the small gaps you can see at the end of the curves, at the end of the current curves on the top left plot, is due to differences in current from forward and backward sweep. So the computer doing these measurements sweeps the VDS, the drain source voltage, from 0 to -20, and then sweeps back from -20 and 0. The curves should be the same values for the forward sweep as it is for the backward sweep, but the gap shows that there are some irregularities. Both these issues, the low drain voltage, drain source voltage curvature, and the gaps between the forward and backward sweeps, are issues due to the trap states within the semiconductor lattice. A way to investigate the charge traps is to run CV analysis on similar devices that use organic semiconductors, which was what my project was last semester, and what I continue to work on after these IV measurements. Now on to the CV measurement project. This is a project that I was working on at NIST from fall 2019 semester, and what I was supposed to continue working on this semester, but due to the length of time it took for materials to be shipped in, I couldn't work on this project. So I was working on the IV measurement project in the meantime. Capacitance voltage analysis on MOS stacks can provide the information necessary to determine the trap densities, energy levels of these traps, and what types of traps are present within the semiconductor layer. The data from last semester were inconclusive, probably due to materials and device creation processes resulting in flawed samples. So to move on with the project, since the devices from the last semester weren't giving the proper measurements, we decided to make new samples for the project. Multiple changes were made to the production of the new samples. First, the materials used have been changed. In the previous project, we used rubrene as the main semiconductor and cytop as the main dielectric. This semester, we're going to use organic semiconductor called DTT, and silicon dioxide dielectric coated silicon wafer, like the one that was used for the IV measurement project. Different dielectrics such as Teflon were considered as well. To make the organic semiconductor layer, instead of coating directly on top of the dielectric, like what we were doing from last semester, we were going to use a PDMS stamp to transfer a semiconductor layer made on a different surface onto the dielectric of the main sample. This method was proposed because the problems from the previous samples could have been caused by coating and heating the semiconductor's layer, on top of the dielectric layer, which could have resulted in structural deformity, resulting in irregular results from the measurements. This is an example of, this is a mock-up of the sample that we were planning to make for this semester for the CV measurements. The layer colored light gray is the silicon wafer layer. The blue layer is the dielectric, which is coated completely over the silicon layer. That's how the silicon layers are brought to the laboratory. The DPP-DDT semiconductor layer was the layer that was meant to be transferred over from a different surface on top of our main sample using the PDMS stamp. And then once the semiconductor has been transferred, we then coat the metal layers on top of that, the metal contacts on top of it. Now, due to this pandemic, the lab, I wasn't able to continue my work at the laboratory. So while I was working from home, in lieu of working on the CV samples, I did research on organic semiconductors analysis methods, just to get a better understanding of organic semiconductors in general. One method of determining tramp densities and energy levels for organic semiconductors is running CV analysis on PN junction devices, which uses an organic and inorganic semiconductor to make the PN junction, as pictured on the left over here. A PN junction device is basically a device that uses two semiconductors that are doped with different prevailing charges. P meaning a p-type semiconductor, which has primarily holes and is more of a majority acceptor, and n-type semiconductors, which are primarily doped with negative charges, which are a majority donor. And forming a junction between the two and sandwiching them between two contacts forms what's called a PN junction device. One of those is pictured on the left here, which sandwiches an organic P3HT semiconductor with P dot PSS, which is an inorganic um, polymer semiconductor, which is primarily um, which is a P-type semiconductor layer, and that's sandwiched between um, a, uh, a calcium and the ITO metal metal anodes, metal contacts. I would then run impedance and phase versus frequency measurements on this device and extract capacitance from this data. I would then plot capacitance squared versus voltage, and from this graph I can extract the total trap density by using equations from the Mott-Schottky analysis. Those equations are pictured on the top. The forward bias and reverse bias areas can give information on different kinds of trap states. So different equations are required for each region. The forward bias equation is the very top equation, and the middle equation is the reverse bias equation. Then, by using the doping densities um, within each of these semiconductors, which is manufacturer's metadata that they would give us, I can determine the built-in voltage of the device, which can be used to determine the energy levels of the traps using the energy voltage equivalence, which is the very bottom equation listed on top. Looking ahead, due to the pandemic, physical testing and research has been hindered. Until things clear up, however, I plan to research more into analysis techniques and transistor and sample processing theory and techniques as well. That will help me move forward with my CV analysis project. With the reopening of the labs, I plan to completely make testable samples and start performing measurements on them. And that's it. Thank you for listening to my talk. I'd like to thank Dr. Emily G. Bickle for her continued support and patience with me throughout the semester. And also I'd like to thank Susan Bontemps, Brandy Tolliver, and the PML for allowing me to continue my research at NIST. Hope you're all doing well and hope you all stay safe and take care. Bye-bye.